Laughter cut through the chandelier-lit room. Tristan Weller stood, raised his glass, and smiled like a man who'd never been told no. "Gentlemen, toast Manhattan's Ice Queen." The table wasn't for 2, it was for 8. And every seat was filled with men in tailored suits and hungry eyes. Hannah Whitaker went cold. She was wearing her twin sister Sloane's dress, her sister's perfume, her sister's name, because family had cornered her and called it a favor. She'd been promised a private dinner. Instead, phones were already up, recording. When she tried to stand, Tristan's hand clamped around her wrist. "Don't ruin the show," he whispered, smiling for the cameras. He pulled out a laminated card like a menu. "Since she loves judging people, tonight we judge her." The restaurant laughed. Someone zoomed in. The phone lights turned her into a specimen. Hannah's throat tightened. Her inhaler felt useless in her clutch. Tristan cleared his throat and began to read. Appetizer. Borrowed money and a borrowed spine. Price. Her dignity. Hannah tried to pull free. The table felt like a cage. Tristan's grip tightened. "Dessert!" he shouted. Is the moment she realizes without the Whitaker name, she's just... The words died. Because the entire restaurant fell silent at once. Servers frozen mid-step. Glasses hovering. Air turning heavy. Tristan blinked, irritated. "What? Did somebody..." A man stepped out of the shadows near the private booths. Black suit. No rush. 2 bodyguards behind him like moving walls. He didn't look at Hannah first. He looked at Tristan. "You're disturbing my dinner," he said, quiet, controlled, lethal. Tristan laughed too fast. "And you are?" The man placed a hand on Tristan's shoulder. Friendly, until Tristan's smile twitched. "You think money is power?" The man murmured close to his ear. "You think being loud makes you untouchable?" He leaned in, voice like a verdict. "My name is Gideon Blackwood. A beat. And you're sitting in the wrong place. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more intense stories every day. Don't miss the next episode, things are about to get worse. See you in the next part." Gideon didn't say another word to Tristan. He only kept his hand on the man's shoulder for one more beat, long enough for the entire room to understand that the banquet of humiliation was over. When he withdrew his hand, Tristan sat still, as if nailed to the chair, his mouth still holding that crooked smile, his eyes out of sync, unable to find anything to cling to. Gideon turned slightly and signaled to 2 bodyguards. They didn't rush in, didn't swagger. They simply stepped into the right places, shielding just enough so Hannah was no longer within range of the phones. Hannah felt the air in her lungs still trapped, as if someone's hand were squeezing, but at least the invisible cage around the round table had opened a crack. Gideon looked at her for the first time. His gaze didn't soften. It only became clearer, like an order meant for the whole world, and not for any one person. "Come with me. No one touches her." Hannah stood up, her knees soft as sea foam. She wasn't carried. She wasn't dragged like an object. Gideon only stepped back half a step, making an empty space in front of her. And the 2 bodyguards formed a corridor of bodies in what, moments ago, had been a stage for public shaming. She walked into that space the way you walk into a tunnel, hearing the click of her heels on stone so clearly it felt indecent. People stared, but no one dared to laugh anymore. Chopsticks, wine glasses, and expensive conversations all hung limp, as if someone had flipped a switch. Hannah caught a glimpse of the plastic card that looked like a menu still lying on the table. Black letters stamped into her self-respect like ink. She wanted to turn back and snatch it up, tear it to pieces, but her wrist still throbbed from Tristan's hand, and that pain reminded her that her instinct right now wasn't revenge, it was survival. Gideon led her through a small door along the side of the VIP area. Behind it was a narrow service corridor, washed in pale yellow light, smelling of coffee and warm cloth towels. There was no laughter now, no filming, no running commentary, only her ragged breathing and the steady footsteps of the man ahead, even as a metronome. Hannah clenched her purse, her fingers brushing the inhaler. She drew in a breath, but it snagged in her throat and wouldn't go down. Gideon didn't ask if she was okay, as if that question was too late and too useless. He only set the rhythm. Straight ahead. Don't look back. Don't stop. And strangely, that rhythm kept her from folding in on herself. The back door opened. The cold night wind of New York slapped Hannah's face like a warning. Flashbulbs exploded immediately. Voices hurled her name into the air, shouting, warped, jagged in her ears. "Sloane, Sloane, look over here. Are you dating him? Were you kidnapped? Hannah flinched, her heart surging into her throat. By instinct, she wanted to shrink, but the two bodyguards shifted at an angle, like moving walls, blocking most of the lenses. Gideon stepped out first. He didn't raise a hand in threat. He didn't gesture for them to leave. He only looked straight at the crowd. And in that instant, the paparazzi seemed to step back half a pace, even though their feet didn't move. A black car slid forward, the rear door opening. Gideon didn't touch Hannah. He only placed his hand on the doorframe, as if marking the path. Hannah understood. She lowered her head and got in. The scent of clean, cool leather, a faint note of sandalwood, a kind of luxury that didn't need to show off. The door shut, and the noise outside was cut off like someone closing a lid. Hannah was still shaking, but shaking in silence was easier to endure than shaking under hundreds of eyes. The car pulled away. The city slipped past the window like film being fast-forwarded. Hannah looked down at her hand and saw the red mark around her wrist, and the humiliation rose again like dirty water. She opened her phone with the naive thought that at least she'd escaped. The screen lit up. Notifications kept popping. One link, then another, then another. Headlines cropped like knives. Manhattan's Ice Queen humiliated. Whitaker heiress exposed. Video inside. Hannah tapped, her fingers ice cold. The screen filled with the round table, the harsh lights, Tristan's voice reading every word. She heard herself saying, "Please." She heard the restaurant's laughter. She heard the dead quiet moment before Gideon stepped in. And she saw her own face, cruelly clear. A comment slid across the screen like a tack hammered in. "She deserves it. She's a good actress. Who does she think she is, acting so high and mighty?" Hannah's breath caught. Not because they were insulting her, but because they were insulting the wrong person, and that mistake would grind down the only thing she truly had. Her career, her reputation, the silence she'd built with 10 years of discipline. She stammered, her lips making no sound. No, no, no. The library board. She thought of meetings, ethics rules, the assessing eyes. She pictured them playing the video right in front of her and asking if she was the woman in it. Gideon sat across from her, silent. City light broke over his face in slabs of shadow and brightness. He didn't look at her screen, as if he'd known this would happen all along. Hannah lifted her head, her voice raw. "They'll destroy me," Gideon answered slowly, as if setting each word down on the floor. "They'll try, but they haven't done it yet." Just then, Hannah's phone vibrated again. Then again, back to back. A new thread of messages appeared. The sender's name tightened her stomach into a knot. Library board. She opened it, her eyes skimming the lines the way you skim a sentence of judgment. Mandatory ethics meeting. Tomorrow. The car stopped in front of a building in Tribeca, its dark glass facade and spotless entrance looking like it didn't belong to the noisy city outside. Gideon brought Hannah into the lobby through a way where no one was waiting, only a doorman who nodded with proper restraint and then turned away as if he hadn't seen anything at all. The elevator rose straight up without stopping, and the sound of the cables sliding past Hannah's ears felt like a thin cord pulled so tight that one more comment online could snap it. The doors opened onto a spacious apartment, the lighting warm enough, understated, yet still making her feel like she'd stepped by mistake into another expensive world. Gideon didn't invite her to sit right away. He only walked to the small table by the door, set down a bottle of water and a small towel, then stepped back half a pace, as if returning the choice to her. Hannah took the bottle, but her hand still shook, the cap clicking softly. She raised the inhaler to her mouth, drew one short breath, then drew another, as if she couldn't trust her body to obey. Gideon watched it all with a kind of silence that didn't allow performance. He didn't really ask if she was afraid, because fear was already visible in the way she stood closer to the door than to the chairs, in the way her eyes kept flicking toward the hallway, searching for an exit even though no one was chasing her. When she blurted out an apology for being a bother, for pulling him into trouble, for stepping into his dinner by mistake, Gideon only frowned slightly, as if that apology was a more toxic habit than any scandal. He said, simply, that no one was allowed to touch her, and the words weren't meant to soothe her but to reset the axis of the night. Hannah swallowed hard, looked down at her hands, then felt her phone vibrate one more time. She didn't open it. She was afraid that the bright screen would define her life in words written by other people. Gideon spoke first, his voice still even, asking a question that sounded simple but made Hannah's spine go cold, because it told her he'd seen through her back at the restaurant. "You're not the person they're calling by that name. Hannah lifted her head, her lips pressed tight, and in that moment, she understood that if she kept lying, she'd go on living under a name that wasn't hers. She nodded, very lightly, as if any stronger motion would bring everything down. I'm Hannah Whitaker, and Sloane is my twin sister. As the sentence fell to the floor, the room seemed to widen, and also to empty out. Gideon didn't look surprised. He only watched her like someone piecing together a photograph that had been torn in two. Hannah explained in one long breath, not because she wanted to plead her case, but because once she'd started speaking, she was afraid she'd censor herself again the way she always had. Sloane said it was a blind date, a private dinner, a small thing to protect the family's reputation, because she couldn't appear tonight. Hannah had known it was wrong, but her wrong hadn't begun at the restaurant. It had begun years earlier, in all the moments when she learned to nod so she could stay safe. When Gideon asked why she had agreed, Hannah stared at the rug beneath her feet, as if she feared his eyes would turn her into a true accomplice. Because if I don't do it, they take everything away. Not everything in the tragic movie sense, but the everyday, ice-cold kind of everything. My apartment lease is in the name of a family company. The rent gets paid on time like an invisible leash. I only have to behave, only have to stay quiet, only have to play a role when they want. And every month, there's a small allowance deposited into my account. Not enough for luxury, but enough to keep me from stepping outside, because I'm afraid I'll lose my footing. Hannah let out a short laugh at that, with no joy in it, like someone mocking herself for ever calling it normal. She was still a librarian, still bent over old paper and data, still thinking she could live in a clean kind of silence, but it turned out her silence had been bought a long time ago. Gideon listened without interrupting. He watched the smallest fragments, like a man who was used to reading truth from detail rather than from defense. He noticed how Hannah automatically said she was sorry, even though no one had accused her. He noticed how she kept the inhaler close beside her hand, the way you keep an emergency key. He noticed how her eyes kept measuring the distance from the chair to the door, as if she'd once been trapped in rooms with no way out. He said the woman in the video wasn't a predator, because predators don't apologize while they're being humiliated, and predators don't carry an inhaler the way they carry life itself. Hannah heard that, and her chest tightened. Not because she was being defended, but because for the first time, someone named the true shape of her fear, without using it to control her. She asked softly what she was supposed to do tomorrow with the library board. Gideon said she wouldn't go alone, but more important than that, she had to tell the truth under her real name, because otherwise they would frame her inside the story Sloane had written. Hannah looked up, this time meeting his eyes, and she realized there was a kind of power in Gideon that didn't need to hold her hand to make her steadier, as if he only had to put a wall in the right place for her to breathe. Right then, one of Gideon's people appeared at the end of the hallway and spoke in a low voice. Gideon listened, his gaze darkening for one beat, then turned back to Hannah. He said the technical team had traced the first upload of the clip, not to some random account, but to a phone using a burner SIM, and its trail led to someone inside the political machine, an employee in a senator's office. Hannah felt her stomach drop, because that meant tonight wasn't only Tristan's joke, it was a trap with the hand of real power behind it. Gideon looked at her, his voice still calm, but each word landed like a seal. You stepped into a game where they thought you would stay silent, and from this moment on, they won't be so sure anymore. The next morning, Manhattan still moved as if nothing had happened, but for Hannah, every sound felt like it had been placed under a microscope. She sat in the car, watching buildings slide past, trying to keep her hands from shaking. On her phone screen, new lines of text kept sprouting like mushrooms after rain, not from family, but from strangers who had never known her. They called her by Sloane's name, or by worse words, and they talked about her the way people talk about an object that has fallen off a shelf. One tabloid after another took its turn with the headlines, pushing the video to the top of the page, rebuilding the story in the easiest way to sell it. And in every version of that story, Hannah was not allowed to be Hannah. When the car stopped in front of the library building, she looked up at the familiar facade, the thing that had always made her feel safe. And suddenly, it looked like the door to a courthouse. She stepped out, trying to breathe slowly, and what surprised her was that Gideon didn't come with her. There was no man in black walking at her side, no shadow of authority behind her back to make the world look and flinch. There was only another man waiting at the entrance. Lean, salt and pepper hair, a neat coat, a briefcase clamped close under his arm. eyes clear with the alertness of someone who had sat across from boards that liked to turn small things into big ones. He introduced himself as Owen Klein, an independent attorney. He didn't say much, only that he was here to protect her interests and to make sure this meeting would have a proper record. Hannah understood Gideon's message at once. Power didn't always have to arrive as a large shadow. Sometimes it only had to arrive as a pen that could write down the truth. The hallway leading up to the meeting room was the same old hallway, but today it felt colder, because the people who used to greet her now avoided her eyes, and the people who had never spoken to her looked at her the way you look at a stain on a wall. Outside the room, Hannah caught sight of a television showing a morning entertainment program. On it was a still image of her cut from the video, the moment her face went pale under the glare of a phone light, and the scrolling text at the bottom called her a scandal magnet, as if her life were some dirty field that pulled trouble in from everywhere. Hannah wanted to turn away, but Owen set his hand on the edge of his briefcase, a gesture so small it only reminded her to look straight ahead and keep going. She took a breath and opened the meeting room door. Inside, 5 people sat around a long table. Faces that had shaken her hand at fundraising events, that had praised her careful work, that had said the library needed people like her. Today, they didn't shake her hand. They looked at her the way you look at a file placed on the table. On the tabletop lay a printed packet, the title reading, Emergency Ethics Meeting. Hannah thought she had come here to explain, to lay out the truth, to be heard as a human being. But in the very first sentence, she understood she was wrong. The board chair offered a greeting in a ceremonial tone, then immediately shifted into something cold. Did she know how last night's behavior had affected the library's image? Did she understand that donors didn't want their names appearing next to a scandal? Was she being threatened or coerced by dangerous individuals? Hannah heard the phrase dangerous individuals and felt her stomach tighten, because they had already decided the answer. Another member flipped through papers and read aloud a news excerpt, not caring whether it was true or false, only that it existed. Someone said she had put herself in that situation. Someone said she should have left the moment she realized the dinner wasn't private. Hannah wanted to argue, wanted to say she had tried to stand, wanted to say her wrist still hurt, wanted to say she had been used like a rented name, but every time she opened her mouth, she heard herself beginning with "I'm sorry," like a reflex sunk deep into bone. Owen spoke at the right moment, his voice calm, not attacking, only resetting the rules. He demanded that the meeting be fully recorded, that every accusation be based on evidence, and that any question rooted in speculation or defamation be clearly recorded as speculation. He reminded them that Hannah had a right to legal representation, a right not to answer questions that invaded her private life, and that the board had a duty not to turn this meeting into a hidden trial. For a few seconds, the room went quiet, not because they felt for Hannah, but because they realized someone was taking notes. And in that very moment, Hannah saw clearly that this was not a neutral place. It was a courtroom without a judge, where public opinion sat on the throne, and the truth had to ask permission to speak. Hannah lifted her head, fighting to keep her voice steady, and for the first time she said a sentence that didn't begin with an apology. "My name is Hannah Whitaker. I'm not the person the articles are calling. I was forced to impersonate her, and I can prove it." The board chair faltered, but the gaze stayed cold, as if they didn't care who she was, only whether the library's name would be dragged through mud. The meeting ended with a vague notice that they would consider disciplinary action, that they would follow up, that Hannah should limit her public appearances. Hannah stepped into the hallway, lightheaded in the way a person feels after blood has been drawn and still has to walk straight. Owen walked beside her, offering no hollow comfort. He only said she had done the right thing by using her real name, and that they would need more than a spoken account. They would need evidence, and he would help her keep everything inside a legal framework so it couldn't be twisted backward. When Hannah left the building, the air outside felt colder, and the sound of a camera clicked somewhere. She looked up and saw a stranger on the corner, phone held high, filming her the way you film breaking news. She tried to hurry into the car, her heart running wild, but the moment the door shut, Owen's phone vibrated, and he glanced down. Then his voice went heavy. A tabloid site had just posted a photo of Hannah walking out of Gideon's building last night, the angle blurry enough to let people imagine anything, and the words hit like a fresh slap. "Mafia boss's new girl?" The tabloid clung to Hannah like an oil slick. In the car, she stared at the headline again, her fingers so cold she couldn't even scroll the screen down. Owen said a few things about not reacting too fast, about how everything would be handled in order. But Hannah only heard her own heartbeat and the breath caught tight in her chest. She didn't clearly remember how she got back to Tribeca. She only remembered the dim hallway, the silent elevator, and the door opening onto that familiar scent of sandalwood, like a temporary pocket of stillness. Gideon wasn't in the living room when she walked in. She saw his coat draped over a chair, saw a phone lying face down on the table, and saw that this apartment was like him, spacious, but with clear boundaries, with nothing extra for anyone to cling to. Hannah had just set her bag down when her phone buzzed. The caller's name made her stomach cinch, as if a cord had been yanked. Sloan. Hannah stared at it for a beat, trying to persuade herself that this time she could let it ring, but old habits were like groundwater. One crack was enough for them to rise. She answered. Sloane's voice flowed out sweet as honey, soft as velvet, and because of that it was even more frightening. Hannah, sweetheart, you finally decided to pick up. You had me so worried. The whole city is talking about you. Hannah swallowed hard. I'm not you. I've said that already. Sloane gave a small laugh, a sound that carried pity and mockery at once. Why are you still being stubborn? You want to protect your library, don't you? You want to keep that tiny little dignity, don't you? Listen to me. Come home. We'll handle it. Hannah heard the word home, and her throat turned bitter. Their home had never been home. It was a place where they called her into the living room the way you call an employee. A place where they decided her life in a calm voice. Sloane went on, her tone still smooth. But each word laid a blade against Hannah's neck. You're coming back. You're going to apologize publicly. You're going to say you misunderstood. You're going to sign a new non-disclosure agreement, and everything will settle down. Hannah let out a small laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was hopeless. Apologize for being trapped. Apologize for being filmed. Sloane sighed as if Hannah were a stubborn child. You're ruining everything. You're dragging Father into the mud, and you know Father doesn't like being dragged. Hannah went silent. She knew Sloane had moved to the other half of the gift, the poisoned part. Sloane slowed down, softened, as if soothing her. I don't want to scare you. I just want to remind you that your apartment lease is coming up for renewal. I just want to remind you that that allowance is because the family loves you and wants you stable. And I just want to remind you that your library has donors who are very sensitive to the word Mafia. Hannah could hear her own pulse in her ears. She looked around Gideon's apartment, looked at the tall glass facing the city, and suddenly understood what it meant to be pulled by a string. Everything she thought belonged to her had a cord tied to it by them. She had lived that way for years and called it independence. Tears rose but didn't fall right away, as if her body had learned to keep everything inside so no one could call her weak. You're only the spare, she thought, a confession no one else could hear. If Sloane was busy, Hannah filled in. If the family needed someone to take responsibility, Hannah stepped forward. If they needed a name to cover something, Hannah wore it. She had always been the convenient shadow, not important enough to be respected, but close enough to be used. Sloane lowered her voice, as if offering one last chance. Come back. Don't stay near him. You don't understand him. People like him don't save anyone without taking something. Hannah wanted to say she didn't need to be saved, but she also knew that if she went back, she would disappear again. She set the phone down on the table, her hands shaking hard, then sank onto the edge of the chair as if all strength had been drained out of her. In that moment, the collapse didn't arrive as a scream. It arrived as a heavy exhaustion, as if she had spent her whole life running down a hallway with no doors and only now realized it. Gideon came out from the back, not making any big sound, only enough for Hannah to know he was there. He didn't ask what Sloane had said. He looked at the way Hannah wrapped her arms around her own elbows, as if holding her body together so it wouldn't come apart. Hannah spoke softly, as if she was speaking to herself more than to him. They want me to go back. They want me to apologize. They want me to sign papers. If I don't, they'll take everything. Gideon didn't come too close. He stayed at a distance where she could still breathe, then said a single sentence. Not romantic, not a promise, not a sweetly drawn escape route. They trained you to confuse fear with love. The words cut straight through the thick fog in Hannah's head. She blinked, and for the first time that day she saw something simple and brutally clear. She had called control care. She had called threat protection. She had called being bought stability. Gideon didn't say more. He let that sentence lie between them like a compass. Hannah hadn't even found her voice when the doorbell rang, brief and precise. A courier stood outside, handing over a thick envelope stamped with a law firm's seal. Hannah took it, feeling her hands turn cold again. She tore the edge open. The paper inside was white as new snow, white as a fresh sentence. The heading was an official notice from the Whitaker family's attorney, accusing her of fraud, impersonation, and unlawful use of identity, causing reputational damage, along with a demand that she stop immediately and prepare to face legal action. Hannah read that far, and her vision dimmed, not from surprise, but because she knew the string had begun to tighten for real. The attorney's letter lay on the table like a heavy object that could crush everything with only a few cold lines of text. Hannah read it again, slower this time, like someone trying to find a gap in a trap. In her head, she could hear Sloane telling her to come home, the library board asking questions like a courtroom, the internet laughing, and threaded through it all was Gideon's sentence, set down like bedrock, about how they had trained her to mistake fear for love. She stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street. New York was still living. People were still walking dogs, carrying coffee, hurrying to catch the subway. She envied that normalcy until her throat tightened. Gideon didn't rush to say anything else. He waited until she could breathe again. Then he went to the small table by the door, took a thin notebook and a pen, and set them down like a contract that didn't need a signature. Hannah turned back and saw him looking at her with a calm that might have made someone else angry, but for her felt like a handrail. He said that from now on, everything had to have clear rules. Not rules to bind her, but rules to loosen the knots. Hannah frowned, as if wary of anything called a rule, because her whole life had been lived inside other people's laws. Gideon spoke slowly, each point set straight like bricks in a line. She could leave this place any time, without asking permission. She could go back to work at the library. She could meet with Owen Klein. She could talk to June Callahan. She could answer the media or stay silent. The choice was hers. No one was allowed to decide for her. If she wanted someone close to ensure her safety, he would arrange it, but only if she agreed. And that person would keep a proper distance. If she didn't want it, he wouldn't put a shadow on her shoulder. Hannah looked at him as if he were something unfamiliar, because she was used to people who gave only so they could take back. She wanted to ask why, but the question now felt like another trap, and she didn't have the strength. Gideon added one more sentence, not soft, but clear. He didn't need her to owe him. He only needed her intact enough to decide for herself. Hannah felt heat rise in her throat. She didn't break down crying. She only felt something inside her begin to tremble. Because for the first time, someone had said plainly that she had the right to choose. Gideon turned and called someone by a short name. A man stepped in, not a heavy bodyguard, but the technical type, holding a tablet, eyes sharp and not curious. He reported that Gideon's team had dug deeper on Tristan Weller, not just a rich man who enjoyed cruel games. Tristan had a repeating habit, a chain of dinners, staged dates, luxurious rooms, and phones always ready. The videos weren't posted publicly right away. They were kept as leverage, to force other people to stay quiet, sign papers, hand over money, or do things they didn't want to do. Hannah's hands turned icy as she listened. She remembered the eyes of the men around the table, remembered Tristan reading the menu, and she understood she wasn't the first case. She was only the one placed on the stage at exactly the right time, to serve as a lesson for someone, or a sensational headline for a plan larger than her. Gideon didn't look pleased at finding something dirty. He only looked at Hannah, as if asking whether she was ready to hear more. Hannah drew in a breath, and this time she didn't need the inhaler. Inside her, something flared and ached at once. Not hatred, but the feeling of having her right to choose stolen for so long that now she wanted it back. She turned to Gideon and asked what Owen could do. Gideon said Owen would handle the legal side, but if she wanted them to stop, she would need light. Hannah thought of June, the friend who had always told her that truth wouldn't protect itself unless someone pushed it out of the dark. She picked up her phone and found June Callahan's number. Her finger paused for a beat, because calling June meant accepting that she was stepping out of her quiet life. But that quiet life had already been torn open. Hannah pressed call. June answered almost immediately, her voice tight with worry. Hannah didn't circle around it. I want you to dig, publicly, not quietly to protect me. I want you to dig so they can't hide anymore. On the other end, June went silent for a second, then let out a breath like someone receiving orders to head into battle. Okay, I'll do it. Hannah ended the call, feeling like she had just placed her foot on a new step, high and cold, but at least it was her own step. Gideon didn't praise her, didn't tell her she was brave. He only gave a very slight nod, as if recognizing her choice as valid. Right then, Hannah's phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. No name, no icon, only a single line, like a hook dropped into water. Round 2. Tomorrow. Hannah stared at the screen, her heart pounding. But this time she didn't feel only fear. She felt their confidence that she would shake again and stay silent. And she began to wonder if they wanted a second round, whether she could make the second round the place where they exposed themselves. After the round 2 message, Hannah didn't sleep the way worried people usually sleep. She slept in jolts, dozing and then snapping awake, as if her body were standing guard at the door. In the morning, she sat at the desk Gideon had allowed her to use, where Tribeca light fell onto clean, smooth wood like an unwritten page. She opened her laptop, not to read more cruel comments, but to reach for the only thing that could pull her out of the hunted feeling: data. Gideon kept his word. He didn't stand behind her, didn't ask what she was doing. He simply let the apartment stay quiet and safe, like an archive room where she could think. An hour later, June Callahan sent a link and a file bundle, along with a brief message that she had traced a stream of money through the Whitaker family's charity system, and it didn't flow straight into book funds or community programs the way they claimed. It looped through a logistics company with an innocent-sounding name, the kind of contractor that handled transport and warehousing. June said she wasn't sure whether it was money laundering or just accounting games, but one thing gave her goosebumps. Every paper trail was too clean. Clean the way a person cleans after wiping away footprints. Hannah read it and felt her insides turn cold, not from surprise, but from the familiar sensation of a family that always knew how to make something dirty smell like perfume. She opened the files June had sent, copies of invoices, meeting minutes, sponsorship contracts, and a leaked internal report. On the page, everything looked legitimate, but Hannah didn't read documents the way people read words. She read them the way you read fingerprints. She checked the file creation times. She checked edit histories. She checked the metadata layers ordinary people never see. She scanned the version list, watching the smallest changes the way someone swaps one word to change an entire sentence, the way someone deletes one number to change the whole picture. One file made her stop. A meeting record from the charity board that referenced a large payment to that logistics company. The formatting was meticulous. The digital signature at the bottom looked perfect, as if there were nothing to question. But that perfection was exactly what made Hannah smell staging. She zoomed in on the digital signature, checked the certificate code, compared it to older documents in the library archive that she had once handled for an exhibit on the history of cultural philanthropy. Wealthy people repeat habits. They repeat paper styles, font choices, stamps, date placement. Hannah found a tiny sign, an invisible character in the file title, something that often appears when a document is copied from another template. She traced it back and saw there had been an older version that once existed, but had been deleted from the shared folder. Yet in a storage system, footprints don't vanish entirely. She used a version recovery tool, not hacking, just reading the way the system actually works. The older version surfaced, and inside it there was a line that no longer appeared in the newer file. That line mentioned a legal consulting fee tied to a name Hannah had seen in yesterday's threat letter. Elliot Vance, the Whitaker lawyer. Hannah's skin prickled. Elliot didn't appear in the public report because that would reveal that legal pressure had been used to shape the flow of money. She checked further and saw the digital signature on the newer file had been created later, as if someone had taken the old version, removed the sensitive piece, then stamped it again to make it clean. Hannah sat up straight, her heart beating in a rhythm that wasn't the rhythm of fear. This wasn't the feeling of being publicly shamed anymore. This was the feeling of touching the string that controlled the stage from behind the curtain. She called June right away, her voice low but sharp. "I have proof the file was edited. Elliot Vance's name is in the path." June went quiet for a few seconds, then let out a breath like someone hearing a lock click open. "Send me everything. I'll cross-check with outside sources." Hannah sent it immediately, along with a brief explanation of timestamps, version history, and the invisible character. She didn't dramatize it. She only gave June what she knew for certain, because she understood that the most important thing wasn't to speak loudly, it was to speak accurately. The moment she hit send, her phone buzzed, a message from Owen asking if she had anything new. Hannah replied that there were signs of document manipulation and that Elliot's name appeared. Owen said he would prepare a strategy to protect her if the other side struck back with defamation claims. Hannah read it and felt her throat go dry. She looked out the window, thought of the round 2 message, thought of Tristan's confidence, and wondered whether round 2 was the next dinner or something else, something dirtier, more intricate. She was still thinking when an email arrived. No loud alert, only a subject line sliding into her inbox like a thin blade. No clear sender, only a strange address. Hannah opened it, because if they wanted her afraid, she needed to know what kind of fear they were using. The body contained only one short sentence, without emotion, without fingerprints, like a system reminder. Stop digging or you'll be declared unstable. Hannah stared at the word unstable, and the blood in her body went cold. That wasn't only a threat of lawsuits. It was the thing they had used to lock her mouth when she was small, turning her voice into a psychological problem, turning resistance into proof that she was not reliable. She clenched her hand until it hurt, then drew a deep breath, remembering a flash of the past she had never told anyone. And this time, instead of shutting down, she took a screenshot, saved everything, and sent it straight to Owen and June. If they wanted to call her unstable, she would show them who was so afraid of the truth that they had to use that word as a weapon. The threatening email sat in her inbox like an ink stain that couldn't be wiped away, and it was precisely that stain that made Hannah understand they were paying real attention now. Owen wrote back that she absolutely must not be alone in any meetings, that every exchange had to be preserved, and that they would prepare a plan in case the Whitakers played the mental smear card. June responded even faster, saying the logistics path Hannah had found led to a warehouse in New Jersey, not too far, but far enough that people assumed no one would bother checking. Hannah read it, looked down at the inhaler beside her laptop, then lifted her eyes to Gideon. He was standing by the window, the city's dim light draped over his shoulders like a cloak that didn't need a name. Hannah said she wanted to go there. Gideon turned back, not refusing right away, but his eyes changed, as if he were measuring risk the way someone measures a crack in a wall. Hannah kept talking before he could cut in. I'm not going to be bait. I'm going to get evidence. I can read paperwork faster. I know what looks clean in a fake way, and I don't want to sit here and wait while they decide whether I'm allowed to be a real person. Gideon held silence for a beat, then asked whether she knew what they could do if she showed up there. Hannah said she knew, and that was exactly why she wanted to go the legal way, with witnesses, to take what could pull her out from under the unstable label. Gideon didn't say she was reckless. He only set terms. They would go in daylight, not at night. Hannah would not leave his line of sight. She wasn't to touch anything on her own without a clear reason. If there were any sign of danger, they would turn back immediately, and she would choose who went with them. Hannah understood. She nodded. Gideon called for 1 guard, not 2, and ordered the distance to be right, enough for safety, but not enough to make her look like someone being marched. When they got out of the car in New Jersey, the scenery changed like a film shifting color. Long rows of warehouses, chain-link fences, truck noise, the smell of oil and damp cardboard. No chandeliers, no wine, only the rough busyness of a place where things were moved along and no one asked where they came from. Hannah looked at the logistics company sign, a harmless name like a sticker on a box, and it made her trust it less. They didn't barge in the way movies do. Gideon worked like a man who was used to front doors. He handed over a business card, said briefly that they were checking an incident related to shipping documentation and needed to verify a few records. His voice didn't threaten, but it was firm enough that the other person didn't want to ask too many questions. The warehouse manager led them into a small room with a computer, a filing cabinet, and an old printer that rattled and whined. Hannah looked around, her eyes automatically finding exits, but this time not from panic, from survival habit. She sat down and opened the manifests on the screen, shipping tables with receiving signatures, routes, item codes. She searched for what June had mentioned. Donations recorded as relief goods, items for the community, books, cultural supplies. On paper, everything looked as clean as a humanitarian campaign. But Hannah didn't only look at item names. She looked at how they were entered, at the identifiers, at the strange repetition of a few transport routes, at destinations that didn't make sense for charitable purpose. One shipment listed as books for a school, but the destination was a transfer facility with no school anywhere nearby. Another listed as supplies for a community program, but it ran through layers of subcontractors as if someone wanted to blur the trail. Hannah felt a cold current move through her chest. This wasn't a warehouse of forbidden things in the violent sense people imagine when they hear the word mafia. There were no guns, no drugs. This was something else, something harder to catch. Money. Money wrapped in kindness. Money moving through boxes labeled with beautiful words. The bait she had feared, that they would find something monstrous, turned out to be a truth even more monstrous, in a more subtle way. A laundering system disguised as charity, turning help into a transport lane for power. Hannah found a service fee entry, and in the notes there was a reference code that matched the edited file from last night. She photographed it, saved it, noted the time, and asked the manager to print a verification copy so there would be a legitimate trail. Gideon stood beside her, not pushing, not interfering, only occasionally asking one well-timed question, as if he understood Hannah's weapon was precision. When they left the warehouse, the sky was gray like a page that hadn't been written on yet, and the wind stung their faces. Hannah got back into the car, feeling like she had won a small round that no one would applaud. She looked at the printouts on her lap like a life preserver. The car merged onto the highway, and in the rearview mirror Hannah saw another vehicle appear, holding a distance that wasn't obvious, but also wasn't disappearing. She spoke softly, perhaps only to make sure she wasn't imagining it. "There's a car following us." Gideon didn't stare at the mirror for long. He only gave a slight nod, his hand steady on the wheel, not speeding up, not swerving, not doing anything that would turn a tale into a chase worth a headline. He lifted his phone and called a number he knew by heart, his voice calm, like setting a glass of water down on a table. "Someone is behind us on this route. Check the plate and keep a team at the next exit." Hannah looked at him, and in that calm she recognized something frightening and also dependable. Gideon didn't need to run. He only needed to call the right person at the right time. The car behind them kept its steady rhythm, like a clock hand deliberately tapping on Hannah's nerves. But Gideon didn't turn the highway into a stage. He had his people identify the plate and track it from a distance. Then he kept driving as if it were nothing more than a crosswind. Hannah tried to keep her eyes forward, but every time the rearview mirror flashed, her chest tightened. She had thought that if they were targeted, it would be something blunt, a forced merge, a roadside block, something obvious enough that you could name it danger. But when the blue and red lights flared behind them, she understood they had chosen something else, something more expensive and cleaner. A police car. Gideon pulled over, unhurried, unresisting. Hannah heard the tires roll onto rough shoulder asphalt, heard the strobing lights strike the rear glass like a warning. 2 officers approached. One rested a hand on his belt out of habit. The other looked into the car as if searching for something he had been told to find in advance. Hannah tried to swallow, her hand brushing the inhaler but not taking it out, because she feared any movement would be interpreted as guilt. The officer asked for paperwork, then said they had received a report that this vehicle was connected to unlawful entry at a warehouse facility and the removal of documents not belonging to them. Hannah made a sound that didn't quite become a word. She remembered clearly that they had gone in through the front, spoken with the manager, requested document verification, printed papers. But the way the words unlawful entry and removal were placed in a uniformed mouth made her truth suddenly become something that had to be proven. Gideon handed over documents, his voice calm, neither boasting nor threatening. He asked who the report came from. The officer replied that he didn't need to disclose the source. They only needed cooperation. Hannah felt her hands turn icy. This was the legal trap Owen had warned about, where everything is written in language that can be twisted. Gideon looked at Hannah for a beat, as if he wanted her to understand he wouldn't do anything that made the situation worse. He let them request that the trunk be opened. He let them shine a light into the back seat. He let them ask about the printed papers. Everything unfolded like a play people had rehearsed. The officers took the stack Hannah had brought from the warehouse and flipped through it as if it were evidence. One said these documents might be stolen internal materials. Hannah wanted to blurt out that the manager had printed them, that they were only verification manifests. But Owen had warned her, in situations like this, heated words only give them a reason to note that she is out of control. Gideon spoke for her, not arguing, only asking whether they had a warrant. The officer said this was a check based on a report, that they had the right to detain for verification. Hannah felt her spine go cold, as if warmth were being siphoned away. She understood that the word verification could become a trip to the precinct, a new headline, and another label stamped onto her forehead. Gideon didn't escalate right away. He let it run one more beat, as if to see how far they intended to push it. When one officer said they would bring both of them to the station to be processed, Gideon finally lifted his phone and made a short call, not calling someone to start trouble, but calling the right person to record the truth. He said he wanted their attorney present, and he demanded that every exchange be documented. The officer didn't like it, but he couldn't stop it. 15 minutes later, another car arrived. Owen Klein stepped out, the same steady composure he had worn in the library boardroom, briefcase clamped under his arm. He greeted the officers in the language of law, neither friendly nor defiant. He asked what report they were acting on, who had provided it, and what the legal basis was for holding the papers. When the officer repeated that it was a credible report, Owen opened his case and produced a printout from a dash camera and time-stamped location data, along with a call log of the appointment with the warehouse and an email confirmation from the manager, stating they were permitted to verify documents. He laid each item on the hood like bricks, building a wall. This is when they entered. This is when they left. This is the name of the person who received them. This is the printing of the documents on site. He said that if the officers continued to hold people and papers without a warrant, he would demand that the informant's name be recorded and would consider abuse of authority. The two officers looked at each other, no longer as confident as they had been when the lights first came on. Gideon remained silent, but now his silence was not endurance. It was power standing behind the law. In the end, the officers returned the papers and said they were only following procedure and would report back. Owen didn't claim victory with words. He only requested a copy of the traffic stop report. When the police car drove away, Hannah realized she had been holding her breath far too long. She exhaled, shaking so hard she had to place both hands on her thighs to steady herself. Owen said quietly that this hadn't been a strike meant to scare them. It had been meant to create a record, a legal snare designed to make her look like a lawbreaker, so later any evidence she produced could be dismissed as illegally obtained. Hannah turned to Gideon and asked where the report had come from. Gideon didn't answer immediately. He called his people and told them to trace the security company that had contacted the police. A few minutes later, he received a name and a link. A security contractor with a contract tied to an organization connected to Senator Hargrove. Hannah's throat went dry and raw. So it wasn't only Tristan. Behind his game was a system that could call the police the way you call a service. By the time they got back to Manhattan, the sky had dropped into a heavy layer of cloud. Hannah went into the library to retrieve a few personal items, her employee badge still in her wallet like a promise of her old life. She swiped at the door. The light didn't turn on. She tried again, slower. Still nothing. A cold message appeared on the small screen beside the door. Access disabled. Her phone vibrated, not from June or Owen, but from a system email from the library. Its tone as emotionless as a machine. Access revoked pending review. Hannah stood frozen in front of the glass doors she used to belong to, and for the first time she understood what it felt like to have your identity taken away, not with a slap, but with the press of a button. The library door wouldn't open, and the hollow sound of the failed badge scan felt like a slap that left no mark. Hannah stood there for one more beat, staring at her own reflection in the glass, her face washed pale by exhaustion and by the loss of the last refuge she had. Owen guided her away from the entrance before anyone walking by could recognize her and look at her with that curious gaze. On the way back, Hannah didn't speak, because if she did, she was afraid she would break into tears, and she had already cried too much in her head, without a single drop falling. Gideon drove, silent as usual, but this silence was heavier, like a steel door that had just been shut in her face. When they got back to Tribeca, Gideon called a brief meeting with his people in the next room, his voice low and clipped. Hannah didn't catch everything, only fragments like verify, source, clean up, and a last sentence he held down, a sentence she guessed belonged to his world. Handle it fast, clean, leave no loose ends. She had once thought she would want that, want someone to make those people disappear from her life as if they had never existed. But when she looked down at the old red mark still on her wrist, when she thought of the email calling her unstable, when she remembered her library access being revoked with a single click, she understood that if she let Gideon use that method, she would lose her right to choose again. Only this time at the hands of someone on her side. Hannah walked into the room, waited until he ended the call, then spoke plainly. No detours. Her voice rough but firm. Don't turn my life into a reason for someone to disappear. Gideon looked at her. His gaze darkened for one beat, not because he was angry at her, but because he was weighing his own instincts against her demand. Hannah could see in him a controlled violence, like a knife still in its sheath. and she knew that if she nodded, he could draw it. But she didn't want blood. She wanted evidence. She wanted a path where, when she looked back, she wouldn't have to ask what she had become in order to survive. Gideon asked one short question. Did she understand it would be slower? Hannah nodded. I understand, but I want them punished by the light, not swallowed by the dark. Gideon stayed silent for a long time, then gave a small nod. Okay. He turned, called his people back, and changed the orders the way a driver changes the angle of the wheel. Don't do anything that makes someone disappear. Only collect. Only lock doors with law and money. Hannah heard it, and for the first time all day she felt she still owned a decision. But that decision would only matter if she had something to put on the table, something that couldn't be twisted into a different story. Hannah opened her laptop and returned to the files June had sent, the metadata she had read, and she focused on the video that had ruined her. She remembered Gideon saying the technical team had traced the burner sim to a political employee, but she wanted something clearer, something that could stand in court and in public. She downloaded the highest quality original June could obtain, then used the tools she normally used for archiving. Only this time she was archiving living truth. She checked the encoded information inside the video file, traces of the recording device, the editing software, the forwarding chain. Ordinary people only see images. Hannah saw the layer beneath, where everything leaves a mark. She discovered the video had been uploaded through an intermediary app, then re-uploaded by another account to wipe fingerprints. But wiping clean is almost impossible. In a small corner of the metadata, there was a device code, like a vehicle identification number for the phone that had filmed it. Hannah compared that code against a list of devices that had appeared in other files June had gathered from leaks tied to Tristan's circle. She wasn't sure it would match, but when the line of code appeared identical, her heart slammed so hard it hurt. The same device, the same source. That meant this wasn't a random moment someone happened to film. This was a sequence, a plan, a machine that had been running before Hannah ever walked into the restaurant. She immediately took screenshots, saved them, and sent them to Owen and June, along with a brief explanation of the comparison method. Owen replied almost at once that this was what they needed to prove coordination, to counter the accusation that Hannah had brought it on herself or staged it. June sent back one sentence that made Hannah's skin prickle, that if the same device had filmed multiple incidents, it was highly likely they had an entire archive used to pressure other people. Hannah looked up at Gideon. She didn't smile, but her eyes brightened a little, because this was the first small victory not won by him threatening anyone, but by her reading the truth correctly. Gideon saw it, and he shifted the whole strategy the way a commander shifts the battlefield. He called Owen and said they would move through financial and legal channels, freeze cash flows, send audit requests, pressure Whitaker partners with reputational risk notices, and most important, protect Hannah against any counterstrike. Hannah had barely managed to exhale when her phone began vibrating nonstop. Not a single message, but a flood of social notifications and a link June sent. A new statement from Nora Pike, the Whitaker head of public relations, appeared across multiple channels at once, its tone cold and polished, talking about concern for Hannah's safety, about the family having lost contact, about the possibility that she was being coerced and held by dangerous people. Hannah finished reading and felt the blood drain from her face. They didn't only want her to lose her job, they wanted to turn her into a hostage inside their story. And this time, they were preparing another lock, not on the library doors, but on her voice itself. Nora Pike's post spread fast, like a press release already placed on editors' desks, only waiting for the right hour to be unleashed. Hannah read every line, feeling as if she were being wrapped into an easy-to-swallow story. A lost girl, a worried family, a dangerous man, and an unspoken conclusion that she was no longer capable of deciding for herself. Owen called immediately, his voice more severe than she had ever heard it, saying this was not mindless gossip for clicks. This was a move with legal intent. If they could persuade the public and authorities that Hannah was being controlled, they could seek a court order, a no-contact order, even force her into a mandatory evaluation, and then anything she said would be labeled emotional, unstable, not credible. Hannah heard the word evaluation and felt her heart lurch, as if she were being pulled back into the years when she was small, when any resistance was called a problem. Gideon did not let that fear drag her back into the old place. He did not slam a table. He did not say he would deal with Nora. He simply shifted into work like a precise machine. He told Owen to prepare a voluntary statement, clear and direct, that Hannah was here by her own choice, not coerced, not held, and that she had independent legal representation. He instructed security to extract camera footage from the building and the apartment, not to show off, but to prove the simplest thing public relations was deliberately twisting. Hannah could come and go. She could leave. She could meet anyone she wanted. Hannah watched Gideon, and in the way he responded, she saw a kind of power that did not need noise. He turned words into records, feelings into evidence, public relations tricks into a matter that could be countered. And still, Hannah felt a hollow space in her chest, because they were not only attacking her with law, they were attacking her with story, and that story cast her as a helpless victim. She was exhausted from other people deciding who she was. Owen said they needed one more thing to keep Hannah standing from the inside, not only standing on paper, and that was how Dr. Maren Holt arrived, not as a glossy healing character, but as someone who knew how to place a lamp in the right spot. She came to the apartment by an appointment that had been arranged, calm in manner, her voice gentle but not weak. Hannah sat across from her, at first still clinging to old habit, lowering her eyes, apologizing for being a bother, apologizing for trouble, apologizing for her own feelings. Dr. Holt didn't scold her. She simply stopped it with a question that made Hannah freeze. "What are you apologizing for?" Hannah opened her mouth and couldn't answer, because she had apologized her whole life, sometimes apologizing for what other people had done to her. Dr. Holt said that response was a survival skill, not a character flaw. It had helped Hannah make it through her family, but now, if Hannah wanted her life back, she needed a new language, the language of boundaries. She asked Hannah to try saying one sentence without an apology. Hannah looked down at her hands, saw half-bitten nails, saw traces of months of tension, then tried, her voice small but clear. "I am not comfortable being called out of control. I want all communication about me to go through my attorney. I will not sign anything without reading it." Dr. Holt nodded, as if Hannah had just laid the first brick of a home. She taught Hannah to tell the difference between fear and intuition, the difference between silence for self-protection and silence that is forced, and most of all, how to say no without over-explaining. Hannah felt strange, like she was learning a language she should have been taught as a child. Outside, Gideon and Owen raced Nora's narrative. Owen sent a formal response to the Whitakers and relevant parties, stating clearly that Hannah had legal counsel, while also preparing a notarized voluntary statement. Gideon demanded the building provide entry and exit logs with timestamps, and provide lobby footage showing Hannah walking out on her own with Owen for meetings, returning on her own, no dragging, no locked doors. Hannah didn't feel relief right away, but she no longer felt alone in having to prove she was capable. By late afternoon, Owen said they had blocked the path to an emergency order, at least temporarily, because the other side would have to explain why a woman with independent counsel, a voluntary record, and evidence of free movement was being described as detained. Hannah thought maybe today they had held one wall, but when she checked her phone, June sent a photo taken at the library. Sloane was standing right in the lobby, a white dress spotless, a smile both beautiful and poisonous, as if she had never pushed Hannah into a trap. Hannah stared at the image and her stomach twisted. June texted that Sloane looked confident, talking with a few people in the library as if it were still her territory. Before Hannah could react, her phone rang, a call with no saved name but a voice she recognized instantly. Sloane spoke as if they were having a friendly chat. "You shouldn't fight the current, Hannah. They're getting ready to take your job. Then they'll take your voice, and I'll stand there and watch you disappear, the way you always do." Sloane's call ended, but Hannah could still hear her sister's laugh echoing in her ears, that familiar laugh from childhood, always sounding like a caress and then a twist. Dr. Holt had warned Hannah not to let threats pull her into panic, to name the feeling, to hold on to an anchor, but Hannah knew there were things you couldn't solve with breathing alone. Sloane had walked into the library as if she were stepping into her own yard, and that was not only a show of power, it was a reminder that the family could come and take everything Hannah had, right in front of the people who used to call her a colleague. Hannah didn't ask Gideon whether he would go with her. She only told Owen that she would not meet Sloane alone, and she wanted everything recorded if possible. Owen suggested meeting in a public place with cameras, so they chose a small room on the lower level of the library, a space usually used for internal meetings. When Hannah stepped in, Sloane was already seated, her posture perfect like a magazine photo, her phone resting on the table like a harmless prop. A public relations person had come with her, standing by the door with a thick folder bag in hand. Hannah glanced around by instinct, locating exits, then reminded herself she didn't need to run. She sat down across from Sloane. Owen sat slightly angled toward her, silent as a legal shield. Sloane looked Hannah over, her gaze sweeping quickly, as if checking whether she was still the easy shadow to control. Then she smiled, her voice so sweet that an outsider might think this was a family reconciliation. "You're making everything harder than it needs to be, Hannah. I came to help you get out of this." The public relations person set the folder bag on the table and pulled out a new non-disclosure agreement. White paper, black text, so many pages it made you tired just looking at it. Sloane said that if Hannah simply signed, everything would go smooth. They would say the video had been edited, say Hannah had been misunderstood, say the family was supporting a younger sister through a difficult time, and most important, they had prepared a short apology video, a sincere message to calm the public. Sloane slid her phone toward Hannah. On the screen was a script already written, every sentence perfectly punctuated, leaving no room for rough truth. Hannah read it and felt her own name being used like a sticker. "I apologize for causing inconvenience to the library community. I apologize for making everyone worry. I apologize for allowing myself to fall into a situation that could be misunderstood." Not one line said she had been forced to impersonate. Not one line said Tristan had filmed her to humiliate her. Not one line mentioned the threatening attorney letter, or the email calling her unstable. It was all rewritten neatly to keep the Whitaker name clean. Hannah looked up and saw Sloane waiting, her patience wearing the face of a good sister, but her eyes cold, because she knew Hannah was always afraid of being a burden. Sloane spoke gently, as if pouring more honey. "Sign it, read the script, film a video at home. I'll have someone adjust the lighting so you look good, make you look truly pitiful but still elegant. The public loves that." Hannah felt heat rise in her throat, but this time it didn't shove her into panic. It shoved her into something else, a painful clarity. She remembered Dr. Holt's words about boundaries, about not needing to apologize in order to exist. She looked at the script, then at Sloane, and she realized this scene was the room with no exit from her childhood. Only now she was grown. She had a lawyer beside her. She had data in her hands, and she had a silent man out there who wasn't forcing her to do anything. Sloane repeated herself, her voice turning harder beneath the velvet. "Do you understand what pressure Father is under? Do you understand the library won't keep someone carrying scandal? Do you understand your tiny apartment will disappear if you don't behave?" Hannah placed her hand on the table, feeling the cold wood, and she said one word without apology, without trembling, as if she were speaking her own name for the first time. "No." Sloane blinked. The smile on her mouth stalled for half a beat. "What did you say?" Hannah repeated it, still calm. "I won't sign. I won't film an apology video from your script. I won't take blame for someone else's dirty game." The public relations person behind her shifted slightly, as if preparing to step in, but Owen raised his hand, a small gesture, and the room went quiet again. Sloane leaned forward, her voice smaller now but sharper, like a blade honed under the table. "You think you've won because you have Gideon Blackwood. You think he'll stay there forever. You want a war with Father." Hannah met her gaze. "I want the truth." Sloane laughed, but this time there was no sweetness left in it. "I truly don't understand why you keep trying to be a hero. You've forgotten, haven't you? The worst things aren't on the internet. They're in files. They're in the things Father buried a long time ago." As she spoke, Sloane shook her head as if in regret, then slipped, a moment of confidence too loose, and the truth slid out. "That old accident file, the one tied to the port contract, Father already handled it. Don't dig it up, or you'll regret it." A cold line ran down Hannah's spine. An old accident. A port contract. This was no longer about the Whitakers keeping their image clean. It was a deep pit connected to logistics, to money flow, to the senator, to all the traces they were following. Owen looked at Hannah, his eyes saying, "Remember every word." Hannah didn't answer Sloane right away. She only stood, pulled her phone back to herself, and said her final sentence like a door closing. "Keep your script. I'll keep my name." When Hannah and Owen stepped out of the room, Hannah realized her legs were still steady, and that was the strangest thing of all. She had said no without breaking. She had barely reached the hallway when her phone vibrated. June was calling, her voice urgent, with no detours, like someone who had just found the piece that changed the whole picture. "Hannah, I found the meeting minutes. The senator's name is in there. June's call made the library hallway feel as if it were narrowing, the air thickening the way it does before rain. Hannah listened to every word, meeting minutes, the senator's name, and in her mind the pieces began sliding into their proper places, no longer scattered traces, but a deliberate line. She forced her voice to stay steady, and asked where June was, where the source came from, whether she had a copy, whether there were timestamps. June said she had both a scanned version and photos of the original, along with the related email chain, and she would send everything to Owen immediately. Hannah ended the call and stood still for one beat, then felt something inside her vibrate with fear and anger at once. Not the kind of anger that wants to smash things, but anger that they could do all of this and still be called decent people. Owen looked at her and asked if she was okay. Hannah nodded, but the nod felt like a shake on the inside. Because at that same moment, Sloane's slip about the old accident file pushed open a door of memory Hannah had kept locked for years. It didn't arrive as a long film. It arrived like a familiar scent, sudden enough to choke you. She saw herself again as a teenager, standing in the Whitaker living room, where everything was glossy and cold. She remembered the piano covered with a cloth, the tall vase arranged as if to hide the empty space, her father seated behind his desk like a statue in a suit. She had said something that day, a small protest about how Sloane had treated one of her friends at school, or about a party she didn't want to attend. She couldn't remember exactly. She only remembered the feeling of wanting to say no for the first time. Her father didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply set an envelope on the desk, and inside were bank papers and the lease contract for the small place Hannah had been promised for the coming school year. He said, very calmly, that tuition, rent, even the old car she used to get to her part-time job were all handled by the family. He said if Hannah wanted freedom, the family would give freedom by taking everything back. And then he said the sentence that taught Hannah what it meant to be silenced through medicine. He told her her mother had once had unstable periods, and he worried Hannah might inherit it. He suggested, in a tone that sounded like concern, that if Hannah kept resisting and causing trouble, he would take her for an evaluation, just to make sure she was okay. One word, evaluation, and Hannah's whole body turned cold, because she knew that in their world an evaluation wasn't help. It was a stamp, pressed onto your forehead, so that anything you said afterward would be doubted. Hannah remembered going quiet, remembered apologizing, remembered going back to her room and sitting on the bathroom floor, breathing like she had just run out of a burning place. And the next day, the money still hit her account, the lease was still signed, and the whole family behaved as if that conversation had never happened. That was how they operated. Freeze and then switch back on. Reward obedience. Make her doubt her own feelings. The memory flashed once, brief and sharp, just enough for Hannah to understand why the word unstable in yesterday's email had frightened her so much. She returned to the present, hearing footsteps pass in the hallway, hearing the elevator, hearing the paper Owen flipped inside his case, and she felt a new clarity, no longer blurred by shame. They had used that tactic on her before, and they would use it again if she allowed it. Hannah looked at Owen and said a sentence with no apology in it, only decision. I won't let them turn me into a sick person, so I have to stay silent. Owen nodded, his expression like a man who had been waiting for her to say that. He told her that from now on, everything had to follow strategy, not reaction. If they released evidence publicly first, the Whitakers would sue, seek restraining orders, grind her down with procedure. But if they delivered the packet to authorities, and to reputable journalists first, with timestamps and a clean chain of custody, then when the Whitakers counterattacked, they would have to counter a system, not a woman being called unstable. Owen said he would assemble a dossier with the metadata Hannah found, the warehouse manifests, the meeting minutes June had, and the attorney threat letter, all arranged like a story supported by evidence, and he would file it first, in the right place. Hannah listened, and felt that for the first time, there was a path that didn't require her to shout in order to be believed. She thought of Gideon, who had agreed to change his methods because of one sentence from her, and she understood that this path might be slower, but it kept her from becoming what she hated. While they were speaking, Hannah's phone buzzed, and a calendar notification appeared. Not a text, not an anonymous email, but a properly formatted invitation, with an organization name, a polished logo, and a note that made her heart drop as if it had been pulled out of her chest. Gala. Mandatory appearance. Hannah stared at the screen, feeling as if someone had stamped her forehead again. But this time it wasn't the unstable stamp. This time it was a trap blazing under chandeliers. A place where they wanted her to appear in exactly the right spot, so they could control the story, or crush her in front of a crowd. Owen read the line and his face darkened. Hannah tightened her grip on the phone, and in her mind there was only one cold thought left. They didn't want her silent. They wanted her to appear in the way they chose, and if she walked into it, she would have to walk in on her own terms. The gala invitation with the word mandatory sat in Hannah's phone like an expensive necklace tightening by degrees. Owen said they would review the legal terms, see who had the authority to compel attendance, and why the library would send something like that. But Hannah didn't absorb all of it. In her head, one question kept echoing louder than the rest. Why was everything always arranged around her, as if she were only a chess piece? She returned to Tribeca as the rain began to fall, small drops tapping the car window like a reminder that time was moving. Gideon stood in the apartment, one hand holding his phone, his face calm as if he had just finished a string of calls. He looked at Hannah and didn't ask if she was okay, as if he had learned that question didn't help. Hannah set her phone on the table, the screen still lit with the words, "Gala, mandatory appearance." Gideon glanced once, and his eyes darkened very slightly. Hannah felt her anger not as an explosion but as a stone settling in her chest. She had said no to Sloane. She had given evidence to Owen and June. She had endured her library badge being revoked. She had been called unstable, and now they wanted to force her onto a chandelier-lit stage. And through all of it, Gideon had been there like a wall. But every wall has a backside, and suddenly Hannah needed to know his. She turned to Gideon, her voice so calm it surprised even her. "Why me?" The question landed in the living room like a coin dropped into deep water. No loud sound, just circles widening and widening. Gideon didn't answer at once. He held Hannah's gaze longer than usual, as if weighing which truth could be spoken without becoming a weapon. Hannah continued, refusing to slide into apology. "I'm not asking because I think you're bad. I'm asking because I need to know where I'm standing. I've lived long enough inside other people's stories." Gideon set his phone down and stepped closer, still keeping the distance where Hannah could breathe. He said Whitaker was not a new name in his life. That family had been on his list for years. Hannah felt her stomach turn cold, but she didn't step back. Gideon explained in a low voice, not pleading his case, only delivering facts like a report. The Whitakers were tied to logistics routes and under-the-table deals, the kind of things that made other people lose opportunities, lose homes, lose their lifelines, while they stayed clean on stage. Gideon said he had tracked those connections, waiting for a crack big enough to drag them into the light or crush them in his own way. Hannah listened, and suddenly understood why the warehouse in New Jersey had touched Gideon's territory, why a political employee had been linked to a burner sim, why a security contractor connected to a senator could summon police so easily. She looked at Gideon and forced her voice not to shake. "So that night at the restaurant, did you come because of me, or because of them?" Gideon didn't dodge. He admitted half, like a man who didn't know how to make lies pretty. At first, he came because that table was in the VIP area he controlled, and because Tristan was a name he had heard in dirty stories, and because Whitaker always hovered close to those dirty stories. Hannah felt a thin, sharp pain pass through her, not because he confessed, but because she realized she had hoped she was the exception, when she had always lived as the replacement. She clenched her hands, pressing her nails into her palm so she wouldn't fall into her old reactions. Gideon looked straight at her, and then said the second sentence, the one that changed the room's rhythm. "But what happened to you wasn't strategy." He paused for a beat, as if setting a boundary for himself. It crossed the line. It cut through every rule of the game. He said that from the moment he saw her wrist being held, saw phone lights turning her into entertainment, it stopped being about Whitaker, or plans, or targets. It became about a person being publicly humiliated, and he would not let that pass simply because it was convenient. Hannah heard him, and didn't know whether to believe him or fear him, because it sounded like protection, and protection could also be another cage. She thought of Dr. Holt's words, that boundaries are not punishment, they are self-protection. Hannah looked at Gideon and asked what frightened her most. "If I'm no longer the key that gets you to Whitaker, will you still protect me like this?" Gideon didn't answer with a promise. He answered by looking at her like a choice he had to respect. He said she didn't owe him, and she wasn't a tool. He said if she wanted to leave, she could, and if she needed space, he would not force her to stay. Hannah felt her eyes burn, not with sweet emotion, but because for the first time a powerful man was telling her she had the right to walk away without being pulled back. And because of that, she needed to walk away, at least for a while. She needed to check her own heart, to know whether she was leaning on his strength or on herself. Outside, the rain had thickened, drawing long streaks on the glass like lines on another sentence. Hannah took her coat and went to the door. Gideon didn't block her. He didn't ask where she was going. He didn't say it was raining. He only stood still like a wall that knew how to step back. Hannah went down to the street, rain slapping her face cold, wet hair sticking to her forehead, and she let it be a small punishment for the truth she had just heard. She didn't leave to hurt Gideon or prove a point. She left to protect herself from tying her life to someone else again, even if that someone might be good. She walked a little way before her phone vibrated. A message from Gideon, not long, not pleading, not explaining. You decide the distance. I'll hold the perimeter. Hannah stood under the rain, staring at the words, and for the first time, she didn't know what was more frightening, the Whitakers' threats or the respect she had never been given. Hannah slept in a small hotel that rainy night, not because she wanted to hide from Gideon, but because she needed to hear her own voice again in a room that didn't carry the scent of sandalwood and power. She turned off the lights and lay there staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in days, she didn't open social media, didn't read comments, didn't punish herself by watching the video again. She only thought about Gideon's message, that she would decide the distance, and he would hold the perimeter. The strange thing was, that distance didn't make her feel abandoned. It made her feel like she had rights. The next morning she woke up, pulled the curtains, saw the sky was less gray, and the feeling in her chest was no longer panic, but something harder, closer to resolve. She called Owen first, and told him she wanted to meet the library board again, but this time not to beg for mercy. This time to demand due process. Owen said he had prepared a packet, including basic information about the video being staged, about her having legal representation, about the threats and the public relations campaign that had made her workplace no longer safe. Hannah ended the call, then looked at her phone and saw another message from Gideon, only a location and a time, with one short line saying the car would be waiting under the hotel lobby if she needed it. There was no question asking if she was coming back, no invitation. She looked out the window, took a deep breath, and decided to walk out on her own 2 feet. When she came down to the lobby, Gideon was not there. There was only a black car parked farther away than usual, not showy, and a man standing at a distance far enough that she wouldn't feel followed. Hannah understood. That was how Gideon held the perimeter without crossing the door she had set. She got into the car, feeling both empty and light, and all the way to the library, she didn't feel like someone being escorted under guard. She felt like someone going to meet a system to demand her name back. Owen was waiting at the cafe across from the library. He handed her a thin bundle of papers, pointing out what she needed to say and what she did not need to explain. Dr. Holt also texted one short reminder, telling her to use boundary sentences instead of apologies. Hannah folded the papers, slipped them into her bag, then crossed the street. The library's glass doors still didn't accept her badge, but this time she didn't freeze as if her rights had been removed. Owen had scheduled the meeting. A security staff member opened the door for them based on the visitor list, and Hannah walked in without lowering her head. When they entered the meeting room, the board members were already seated, their eyes still cold, but there was a new caution in them, as if they knew this story had grown beyond the scope of an internal meeting. Hannah looked at each of them, then began by stating that she was requesting an independent review of the incident, including how the library had handled misinformation and whether she had been targeted by a smear campaign. She didn't argue feelings. She argued process. She demanded that every allegation be grounded in evidence. She demanded that the library not use tabloid media as the basis for employment decisions. Owen added, in legal language, that locking Hannah's access before any conclusion could be considered preemptive punishment, and that in a context where harassment and threats were indicated, the library had a duty to protect an employee from a toxic environment. One board member repeated the phrase, scandal magnet, but this time Hannah didn't shrink. She looked straight ahead and said the library's reputation should not be protected by sacrificing an employee based on a story built by someone else. She said she was willing to cooperate with an investigation, but she would not be interrogated like a criminal when she was the victim. The room went quiet for a moment, then the chair asked what she wanted, specifically. Hannah answered briefly, like reading terms aloud. An independent review, the right to return to work while there was no conclusion, and a commitment that the library would not allow outside forces to manipulate internal decisions. Owen offered several options for the names of organizations that could conduct an employment and ethics audit. The balance of power shifted slightly. Not much, but enough for Hannah to feel her feet on the floor instead of standing in mud. After a few minutes of deliberation, the board agreed to pause any disciplinary action until the review was complete, and they would consider restoring necessary access in stages, so Hannah would not be cut off from her work entirely. It wasn't a bright victory. There was no applause. But for Hannah, it was the first time an institution stood between her and her family without kneeling to money and rumor. When she stepped out of the meeting room, her shoulders were still tight, but a hollow space in her chest had been filled with something that felt like self-respect. Owen said quietly that this was their first institutional win, and they would hold it with evidence. Hannah walked down to the lobby, where light poured through tall windows, and right then a library courier hurried after her, saying an envelope addressed to her had just been delivered to the office. Hannah took it and felt thick paper, an ivory color, the scent of expensive perfumed stock, and the Gala logo embossed in the corner. She opened it and skimmed the formally printed lines. Her name was spelled wrong in a way that felt deliberate, wrong enough that anyone would notice, wrong like a bully winking at a crowd. Hannah tightened her grip on the invitation and understood they didn't only want her to attend. They wanted her to walk into that brightly lit room with a stain already printed onto her name. The gala invitation with her name misspelled sat in Hannah's hand, like a reminder that they still controlled the stage, only now Hannah could see the strings being pulled behind it. She brought it to Owen and June the way you bring a piece of evidence, not a complaint. June looked at the wrong name and let out a short laugh with no joy in it, saying this was the most subtle kind of humiliation because it could always be disguised as a typo, while everyone understood the real message was that she didn't deserve to be named correctly. Owen did not laugh. He said it was obvious bait. They wanted Hannah to appear so they could define her all over again in front of donors, officials, and friendly media, but Owen didn't tell Hannah to hide. He asked whether Hannah was willing to walk into a trap if the trap could become the place where they blew themselves up. Hannah looked at the invitation, thought of standing at the library door with her badge revoked, thought of the email calling her unstable, thought of Sloane saying they would take her job and then take her voice, and she answered that she would go, but she would not go the way they wanted. June nodded immediately, her eyes bright in the way a reporter's eyes get when she catches the right scent. She said if Hannah had to appear, then they should turn that appearance into a moment calculated down to the minute. Owen began building the board. He didn't talk about revenge. He talked about sequence and timing. They would not throw everything onto the internet in an emotional burst, because then the Whitakers would use law and public relations to grind the story down before it could take shape. Instead, they would prepare a complete evidence packet, arranged like a logical chain of events, with timestamps and independent sources, so that once it left their hands, it could not be dismissed as fiction. Owen divided the parts clearly, the metadata proving coordinated handling of the video, the manifests and logistics routes showing money disguised as charity, the meeting minutes naming the senator and linking the security contractor, the threat letter and the secondary public relations campaign proving intent to isolate Hannah. June picked reporters and outlets with enough credibility, the kind you could not buy with a dinner party, and she said she would send in parallel to the appropriate authorities, so no one could block one channel and still keep the other closed. Everything would be placed in a folder with a verification chain, so anyone who opened it would see it was clean in the only way that mattered, clean because it was true. Hannah listened, her hand resting on the inhaler out of old habit, then realized she hadn't used it once all morning. She asked when they would send it. Owen said 10 minutes before Hannah spoke publicly at the gala. Not earlier, because if earlier, the Whitakers would have time to build fences and seek restraining orders. Not later, because if later, Hannah would be standing alone in front of the crowd, and they would swallow her. 10 minutes was small, but it was enough for time-stamped emails to fly out, enough for a few outsiders to begin reviewing the dossier, and most important, enough to keep the Whitakers from locking the story inside a private room. Hannah heard the plan the way someone hears their breathing being drawn back into rhythm. She had once thought power was a loud voice, standing in the middle of a room and making everyone go quiet the way Gideon had. But power could also be the precision of a clock. While Owen and June built the board, Gideon handled the rest without needing to appear beside Hannah. He kept the door he would not cross, but he made other doors close on the Whitakers in legal ways. Business partners who liked to stay in the middle so they would not offend anyone suddenly received reputational and legal risk warnings from auditors. A few donations and cash streams were placed on hold for due diligence on origin. Requests for records went out, not as threats, but as properly formatted letters, proper procedures, making it clear that dirty games would be examined under a microscope. Gideon did not use violence to force anyone. He used the structure of their world, contracts, audits, liability, to pull them into the light. Hannah felt that impact, not through gunfire, but through urgent calls Owen received, through June's messages that a few sources were beginning to shake, that the Whitakers were trying to claw documents back, that Nora Pike was organizing a new narrative push ahead of the gala. June said they would not chase every rumor. They would hold the timing. The bait and switch Hannah had feared, that the gala would be where she was humiliated again, was now being turned into a controlled blast, not a sentimental dinner, not a romantic night with a mafia boss the internet would paint, but an event where she would step forward with her real name and a real dossier. Hannah held the gala invitation and turned it over in her hands, and for the first time she looked at the misspelled name and did not feel small. She saw it as an ink stain that would be washed clean by truth. Right then, her phone buzzed. A new message from Tristan, short and confident, as if he were still sitting at the head of the table laughing. "You still haven't seen the other videos." Hannah stared at the line and felt cold spill through her. Not only from fear, but because she understood he hadn't only filmed her. He had filmed many people, and if he was texting that right before the gala, it meant he was ready to drop something that could wreck the plan, or wreck her. Hannah looked up at Owen and June, her voice rough but steady. "He has more, and if he's going to use it, then we have to make him throw it in the light, not in the dark." The gala night arrived fast, like a cold wind sweeping through, and Manhattan put on its glittering face, the one Hannah used to think belonged only to people without cracks. The building hosting the event blazed with light. A red carpet stretched long. Laughter rose like the familiar background music of money and photographs. Hannah stepped out of the car in a simple dress chosen to match her own taste, not trying to prove she was elegant, only trying to stay real. She came with Owen. June stayed a little farther back, so she wouldn't be recognized as part of a group preparing to bring down the party. And around them was Gideon's discreet protection, unseen but present, like an invisible circle keeping the space clean. Hannah held a small clutch, and inside were not makeup and lipstick, but a phone already opened to the evidence files, a minimal printed copy, and a notarized letter confirming she was acting voluntarily. She had decided that if anyone tried to call her unstable tonight, she would hand over documents, not tears. June texted one line before Hannah entered the lobby, saying everything was ready and only waiting for the 10-minute timing. Owen checked his watch and reminded Hannah that when he nodded, they would hit send. Hannah nodded back, feeling as if she were standing at the door of the largest archive room of her life, and once she stepped inside, she couldn't walk out the same way she had come in. In the grand hall, men in tuxedos and women in floor-length gowns stood in clusters, speaking about culture, charity, and good deeds in smooth voices. Hannah saw Sloane in the distance, a wineglass in hand, her smile shining as if there were nothing dirty underneath. Hannah also saw Tristan, leaning against a stone column, laughing with someone like a predator accustomed to standing in the middle of the forest while no one dared say his name. When his eyes met Hannah's, he lifted his glass as if greeting a performance about to begin. Hannah didn't lower her head. She walked straight toward the backstage area where the host and the speaking list were controlled. Owen led her into a small waiting room. The door closed. The noise outside softened. June stood in the hallway, phone in hand, eyes on the time like she was watching the hand of a bomb. Owen opened his laptop and did a final check of the recipient list: reputable journalists, relevant authorities, and a few partner attorneys ready to confirm chain of custody. Everything had been prepared with timestamps, with digital signatures, with backups. Hannah watched the screen and saw the files sitting there like a road, and inside her rose a strange feeling, fear and relief at once, like someone finally choosing to step out of a bully's house to call the adults. Owen's watch moved toward the chosen minute. Owen nodded. June hit send first on her phone. Owen hit send on the laptop. Hannah also hit send, forwarding a copy to a backup address they had set up. In that instant, she felt as if she heard a lock turn, but from the outside, emails flew out at once to many places, many people, and each place stamped its own time automatically. No taking it back, no saying it was an accident, no pretending it never existed. June spoke softly, her voice trembling with adrenaline, saying they had just done something the Whitakers couldn't buy back with a phone call. Hannah looked down at her hands and saw they weren't shaking the way she had expected. 10 minutes is a strange span of time, long enough for an editor to open an email and call a desk chief, long enough for a legal assistant to flag a file, long enough for someone with a conscience to begin reading, and also long enough for the Whitakers to realize the party had been wired. Almost immediately, Owen received a call from an unknown number, a polite voice under strain asking to speak privately, asking them to stop, asking them to discuss. Owen refused with one short sentence, saying everything had been filed and now only process remained. June received a message from a source saying Nora Pike was running around backstage, trying to lock microphones, trying to adjust the speaking list. Hannah looked through the narrow crack of the door and saw people beginning to move faster, eyes darting more, as if someone had announced a fire without wanting the guests to know. Gideon did not appear, but his presence was in the doors that did not close. When a major donor tried to call a newspaper to ask them to bury the story, the call went to voicemail because the newsroom already had copies, and they knew that if they buried it, they would be accused. When a Whitaker attorney tried to call and threaten lawsuits, Owen only had to remind them the dossier had gone to multiple places, and any attempt at silencing now would become evidence of obstruction. Doors money usually opened were opening the other way tonight, toward caution. Hannah stood, adjusted her shoulders, and told Owen it was time. Owen nodded and walked beside her into the hallway leading to the stage. Music pulsed in the hall. The host was introducing the next segment. Hannah moved down the long, carpeted corridor, warm golden light washing the walls like framed paintings. She heard her heartbeat, but not the rhythm of panic, the rhythm of someone stepping into truth. When they were only a few steps from the stage door, 2 security staff stepped out to block them, earpieces in, faces polite in the way paid people learn to be without feeling. One said there was an instruction from the organizers, and because of concern that Hannah would disrupt the program, they had been told to ask her to leave the stage area. Owen asked whose instruction, on what basis, and requested to see it in writing. The security staff repeated that it was an internal directive and they were following it. Hannah looked at them, then at Owen, and suddenly understood the twist of the party. They had never intended to let her speak. They intended to lock her out before she reached the light, then retell the story as if she had caused a disturbance and been removed. Hannah hadn't even had time to speak when a hand touched her elbow lightly from behind, not pulling, but stopping her so she wouldn't step into the net. Hannah turned, and at that moment another group of security moved in from the far end of the corridor like a closing door. She was blocked right before the stage, right before the light, and for the first time that night she felt herself being caught again in a hallway with no exit. Only this time she knew exactly what they were doing. The hallway outside the stage door suddenly became a sealed box, where even the warm yellow light smelled like a trap. Hannah stood between Owen and 2 layers of security, hearing the radios crackle like live wires. A security staffer extended a hand, not rough, but unmistakably the gesture of being escorted out by force. Hannah felt her body react with old habit, shoulders tightening, heart surging, and an apology nearly sprang from her mouth like a survival reflex. But at the exact moment that hand touched her elbow, another hand appeared, fast, clean, and so controlled it made almost no sound. Gideon. He didn't charge in like a movie. He didn't shove anyone to the floor. He didn't turn the corridor into chaos. He simply placed his hand on the security man's wrist at the right spot, rotated just enough that the grip released without pain, then stepped forward half a step, placing himself between Hannah and them like a door swinging shut in the opposite direction. His 2 guards didn't flood in. They took angled positions, occupying the exact points that made the hallway no longer convenient for anyone to drag Hannah away. Gideon met the security man's eyes, his voice low, not needing volume because the distance was close. She is here by invitation. If you touch her again, you are creating an incident in front of hundreds of witnesses. The security man swallowed, glanced at his radio as if searching for an order. Gideon wasn't threatening violence. He was threatening consequences, records, the simple truth that this was a place filled with cameras and phones. Owen immediately stepped in, producing the notarized document confirming Hannah was acting voluntarily and demanding that the organizers produce written authorization to bar her from speaking. When no one could produce it, the air in the hallway shifted. The security staff understood they were standing on a line between doing a job and stepping into a story that could destroy their careers. Gideon lowered his voice one more notch, like smothering a flame. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to make sure no one violates her rights. If the organizers want to change the program, let them do it in writing, and let the lawyers handle it. Right now, step back. The security man took half a step back. A gap opened in front of the stage door. Gideon turned to Hannah. This time he didn't take her hand. He didn't pull her through. He only looked at her, as if repeating the message from the rain. She would decide the distance. Hannah held his gaze. Heard Doctor Holt's voice in her mind, teaching her boundaries. Heard June hitting send 10 minutes earlier, and the fear inside her shifted into something sharper. She stepped forward, crossing the opening on her own. Gideon didn't follow directly behind her like a shadow. He stood angled, close enough to guard the doorway, far enough that Hannah was the one stepping into the light. The stage door opened, and music and applause hit her face like a wave. The host was talking about donor generosity, about the future of culture, about inspiring stories. Hannah walked out, and for a second the entire hall seemed to hesitate as they recognized her as the girl from the video. A few people began raising phones. Others held their breath. Hannah looked down toward the front row and saw Charles Whitaker, her father, sitting straight as a statue, his expression calm in the way of a man who always believes he controls the room. She also saw Sloane, her smile gone rigid, and on the other side, Tristan watched her with enjoyment, as if he hoped she would break right here. Hannah took the microphone and did not apologize. She didn't spill emotion. She didn't shout anyone's name. She spoke with the voice of a librarian who had lived her whole life inside evidence. My name is Hannah Whitaker. I am not here to disrupt. I am here to place the truth into the proper record. A low ripple of whispers rose, but Hannah didn't let them steal her rhythm. She signaled the technical crew, and Owen had prepared everything. The screen behind the stage lit up, not with an image of her crying, but with documents, timelines, manifests. Hannah presented it like someone leading an independent audit. This is a manifest from the warehouse in New Jersey, a shipping route recorded as charitable donations. This is the foundation ledger, where funds were routed through a shell logistics company. This is the email and document edit history, showing a file was changed after it was signed, and here is the name of attorney Elliot Vance appearing in the path. Hannah paused at the right moments, letting them grasp that she wasn't inventing it. Then she brought up what changed the color of the room. This is the contact chain of a security contractor who filed the report that led to police stopping our vehicle. That contractor holds a contract connected to Senator Hargrove's office. A small sound of shock rose from the back, like a glass dropping. Hannah didn't let it become chaos. She projected an excerpt from the meeting minutes June had found, where the senator's name appeared on the attendee list and where donations were discussed as an instrument of influence. She didn't draw conclusions for investigators. She only stated what she could prove. I sent this entire dossier to reputable newsrooms and to authorities before I stepped up here. Every document has timestamps and a chain of custody. If anyone wants to call this fiction, they will have to answer with data, not with humiliation. In the hall, more phones lifted higher. Flashes began to strobe, no longer only capturing gowns and smiles, but capturing the moment a system was exposed. Hannah looked toward Charles Whitaker and saw his face go slightly pale, then harden, like a man trying to hold power with muscle. He sprang to his feet, his chair scraping with a harsh squeal, and his arm lifted, his hand poised as if to slap or to command silence, the reflex of someone used to being obeyed. At the same moment, a burst of flashes exploded, freezing the image of his raised hand in public anger for everyone to see. And Hannah understood that tonight's humiliation had not had time to reach her. It had been stopped by truth. But the war had only just begun. Charles Whitaker's raised arm under the flash made the entire ballroom stall for a beat, and then the system snapped into its usual reflex, attacking the story instead of the evidence. A man from the public relations cluster hurried in, murmured into his ear, and pulled him back down into his seat before the image of an enraged philanthropist could be photographed too many more times. Nora Pike appeared at the edge of the stage as fast as a shadow, her face blank, her eyes calculating seconds. Hannah remained standing there, microphone in hand, saying nothing more, because Owen had warned her that once the receipts were on the table, she could not let emotion drag the story away from the data. She looked down at the audience and saw Sloane already on her feet, the fake smile gone, her eyes sharp as a blade. She saw people begin to whisper, no longer whispering about gowns, but about the senator's name that had just been pulled into the light. The wealthy in that room were used to scandal being something that belonged to other people, and tonight they were standing too close to an explosion that could collapse an entire network. Charles Whitaker stood again, this time without raising his hand. He adjusted his tie and took one step forward, as if reclaiming the stage with the voice of a wounded father. He spoke loudly enough for a nearby microphone to catch. The low, familiar tone of authority. My daughter is going through an unstable period. Those documents are fake. She is being used by people with bad motives. Hannah heard the word unstable, and it felt like someone tugged an old wire inside her chest. The wire from her teenage years, from the word evaluation. But she did not shrink. She looked toward Owen, and Owen stepped up, not taking the microphone from Hannah, only standing beside her, producing a notarized document and stating that Hannah had acted voluntarily, with independent legal counsel, and that any claim she was being coerced had already been answered with entry and exit records, camera footage, and written documentation. Nora Pike immediately shifted gears, her voice carrying from below like a speaker trained for it. These documents have not been verified. They may have been altered. And Hannah Whitaker has connections to criminal elements, an implication aimed at Gideon, aimed at the world they wanted the audience to fear. Hannah looked at Nora and then said only one sentence, short as a stamp. Everything has already been filed in advance, and time-stamped by multiple independent parties. If anyone wants to call it fake, submit counter-evidence. That sentence made the room go quiet, because it cut off public relations oxygen. The Whitakers' bait and switch was to drag everything into emotion, into the unstable daughter, into Mafia, so people would forget that the screen showed manifests, ledgers, emails, version histories, and most important, a verification chain that did not belong to Hannah. June texted from the back that a major newsroom had confirmed receipt, and a legal reporter was reviewing timestamps right now. Owen also murmured to Hannah that an authority had sent an automated intake confirmation, meaning the Whitakers could not claim no one had seen it. They could shout fake, but they could not erase the fact that the dossier had been filed. People in the ballroom began turning to look at Charles Whitaker, no longer looking at him as a charity idol, but as a man being questioned. And because of that, the Whitakers switched to the second strike, smearing her by association. A man in Charles's group called out that Hannah was doing this because she was being manipulated, that Gideon Blackwood wanted revenge, that this was a staged performance meant to destroy a decent family. But that blow didn't stick the way it used to, because Hannah was not standing alone. She stood between documents that had been verified. She stood between backups held in many places. She stood beside an independent attorney. And behind her, even without stepping onto the stage, was a network that made people understand that today's words could become tomorrow's record. Tristan couldn't tolerate the stage being taken away from his game. He pushed out of the crowd, laughing louder than necessary, his voice drunk on power. Come on. Everyone knows she loves to perform. He pointed at Hannah as if pointing at an item in an auction. You think you've won. You think a few pieces of paper will save you from what's been filmed. Hannah felt her insides tighten at the words "what's been filmed," and she saw phones in the room tilt toward Tristan like eyes. He didn't notice, or didn't care. He took another step forward, his voice dropping but still loud enough for the stage microphone and dozens of cameras to catch. If you keep going, I'll release everything. Not just tonight's video. All of it. And I promise you won't walk into a single room in Manhattan without being laughed at. A sound of shock rose. Then the whispering swelled like surf. Tristan had accidentally confessed that he had multiple videos, that he used them as threats, that he understood exactly how humiliation functioned as a tool. Hannah saw June in the distance lifting her phone higher, her eyes bright because Tristan had just handed her a golden quote. People around Tristan raised their phones too, not because they loved him, but because they smelled a media blast that didn't require Whitaker permission. Tristan realized it late. His mouth tightened, but too many lenses were already aimed at him. The Whitakers tried to salvage it by pulling him back. Nora Pike tried to push in and claim it was a statement made in the heat of the moment, but everything had already been recorded, shared, uploaded right there in the ballroom by people who belonged to no public relations team at all. Hannah stood still, heart pounding, but this time not from fear. She understood the Whitakers' bait and switch had failed because of Tristan's own greed, because he couldn't stay silent when he was no longer the center, and he had just exposed the mechanism of the game. As the event slid toward chaos, Gideon moved closer to Hannah, not touching her, only positioning himself to shield her so she wouldn't be pulled into the crowd. Owen guided her off the stage through a side exit. June followed, texting as she walked. confirming that multiple independent recordings existed. In the backstage corridor, where the music had died and only hurried voices remained, Gideon glanced at his phone as it buzzed once, then again. He opened it. His expression didn't change, but something cold passed through it. The message came from an unknown number. No name, no hint of origin, only one short line, like a declaration of war. You touched Whitaker. Now you're in the real war. 6 months after the gala night, Manhattan was still bright the way it always was, but Hannah Whitaker no longer walked through it feeling like a name someone had misspelled. She returned to the library through the front entrance. Her access badge had been restored after the independent review, and more important than that, her identity had been returned to its proper place. The official investigation opened layers of connections that had once existed only as rumor, and even if not everything was resolved overnight, one thing had changed. The story was no longer controlled by the people with money and microphones. Hannah didn't just keep her job. She was invited to help build a new transparency code for cultural funding, where every contribution had to come with a verification chain, where every contract had to be stored under standards that could not be altered after it was signed. She worked with a team of auditors and data specialists, turning what she had learned from personal pain into a system that protected others. She didn't speak much about the past in meetings. She spoke about process, about light, about the way truth must be designed to protect itself. The people who once looked at her with suspicion now looked at her with cautious respect, not because she had won a media battle, but because she didn't use her wounds as a weapon. She used them to build a better fence. Gideon was still there, but he didn't stand beside her at every event. He didn't appear in the press with her. He didn't put a ring on her finger as a stamp of ownership. He didn't do public relations for their story. He didn't turn feeling into a campaign. He kept the promise he had texted in the rain. He held the perimeter. When Hannah worked late, a car would wait at a distance, far enough not to draw attention. When she attended important meetings, a discreet watch made sure no one crossed the line. But he didn't step into her apartment unless she invited him. Some evenings, he stood at her door, knocked softly, and waited. Some days, he only texted one short question, "Are you okay?" and accepted the answer that she was busy. That respect wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But for Hannah, it was something that had never existed in her life before. One late autumn afternoon, when sunlight fell through the library windows like golden ribbons, Hannah sat alone in the new small office they had arranged for her, with tidy shelves and a corkboard full of notes about the transparency system. She looked back over the last 6 months, from the trap dinner to the stage lights, from the email calling her unstable to the time-stamped reports. She realized the biggest lesson was not how to defeat a powerful family. It was how not to let herself be defined by fear. She had learned how to say no without shaking, how to set boundaries without apologizing, and how to love without turning herself into a shield. She stood and walked to the office door, where Gideon was waiting out in the hallway, not stepping inside. He looked at her, his eyes not asking, not pushing. Hannah put her hand on the doorknob, and this time she didn't wait for anyone to open it for her. She opened the door from the inside. The gesture was small, but it said everything. She was no longer the girl being pulled through phone light. She was the one who chose when the door opened, and who was allowed to step through. Gideon crossed the threshold only when she tilted her head to invite him, and in that moment there was no vow, no noise, only an understanding that love is not salvation. It is companionship with boundaries. But the world outside didn't pause because one story found its light. On Hannah's desk, a sealed envelope had just been delivered from an anonymous source. The mailing mark indicated it was tied to the same port route she had exposed, the same logistics corridor that had once connected to the Whitakers. But the name printed on the file was no longer Whitaker. It was a larger conglomerate, a name that had once drifted through Gideon's notes like a shadow not yet spoken aloud. Hannah looked at the envelope, feeling the familiar sense of another door beginning to open. She knew the story wasn't over. It had only changed characters. And this time, she didn't tremble, because she had learned that truth can be slow, but when it is prepared the right way, it is stronger than any stage. Hannah's story reminds us that the greatest value doesn't lie in defeating someone. It lies in holding on to your dignity in the middle of storms. Boundaries are not coldness. They are self-respect. Transparency is not a weapon. It is light, so what is right can be seen. If you felt something in this journey, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to learn how to say no in your own life? Do you believe the truth always finds its way into the light in the end? Please subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video so more people can listen to heart-touching stories every day. Thank you for staying with us until the very last minute. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.